So I think it was telling that this morning's keynote was all about trust. And we'll spend a little bit of time here talking a little bit more in detail around trust and how really what we've learned at Gilt is that it is the basic secret ingredient to scaling a tech organization. So essentially, when we look at an organization, when we look at any company out there, you can almost say that the organization itself is just a collection of people. It's not entirely true, because there are things like the brand and other assets that go into it, but ultimately it does come down to the people make an organization. And the idea here is that if we can create an environment where actually there really is trust, so you really trust that your team will bring you back to earth, there really is trust, and that's the enabler that allows people to create great things. And today we're going to tell the story of scaling our tech startup from a blank whiteboard to over 1,000 people today. We're really proud that every day great people contribute beautiful code and innovate constantly. My name is Mike Bryzek. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Gilt Group, Gilt.com. We started the company in 2007. It's about our 6th year. If you don't know Gilt, it's an e-commerce site that brings the best products and brands to consumers at prices of discounts of 50 to 70% off. And the way we do that is by offering time-based sales. So the basic idea is every day at noon Eastern, a new collection of products goes on sale at great prices, and you come back tomorrow, they're no longer available, but there's a new collection of products that are for sale. It's been actually a great place to work because the nature of the business means every day at noon we're subject to a denial of service attack as our customers come to shop. And it's been kind of amazing to watch. One of our great challenges on the tech side is that surge. And it's interesting that there are actually very few technologies that are built for that surge. If we think about elasticity, that watches a general increase in traffic and allows you time to respond. Whereas in Gilt, you know it's coming, but there is no warning other than the clock strikes noon. So we spent a lot of time thinking through how we wanted to grow the company. And personally, when we were starting Gilt, remember there were a few choices of joining another successful e-commerce company and an offer from Amazon personally, which was amazing. And I remember thinking through, do I really want to work at that company? And the answer turned out to be no. And the reason was that I felt working at a company like Amazon, I would have less opportunity to make a significant contribution. So at Gilt, what we've tried to do as we've grown, once we were stable, let's say, really focused on making sure that Gilt remained a place where people could contribute and create meaningful change for the business so that they themselves could be proud of the things that they're building. And today we'll tell a little bit about the story of what we've learned along the way. Just in greater context, one of the questions is why now? Why are we talking about trust today? And I think, broadly speaking, it seems that the shape of the corporation and the organization and hierarchy, command and control, a lot of that is changing today. And it seems to be accelerating. Like the rate of change within corporate structure seems to be accelerating. There's a few different ways to look at it. One is that traditionally many corporate structures, many companies as they've grown, end up being kind of bureaucratic. And a lot of process ends up stifling innovation. And so the idea is that you want to try to do something, but you need approval or sign off or documentation or meetings, or you need to convince other people, or you're simply unable to because the perceived risk of changing something is too high. And so this bureaucracy evolves over time to really protect the business, and in many cases it's really valid. So for example, in a 100,000 person company, it probably makes sense to have a little bit of process to make sure that as people come in and out over hundreds of years, there's continuity. So there's a place. But more and more that role is diminishing, and I think we're seeing newer companies like Facebook, Google, who have really a much different culture internally, Amazon as well, that really developed this idea of decentralization to allow teams to work in parallel and contribute with less red tape. A lot of the change that we're seeing in the corporate workplace, I would argue, is coming because the millennials are entering the workforce. So I'm 36 years old, which means I just missed being a millennial. Personally, I define the millennial generation as entering high school with a web browser as being the defining characteristic. And if you enter high school and you don't have a web browser. You have to learn about these ancient things called libraries and books and study groups and research projects. And when you don't know something, you have to figure out how to find that information. And so you follow a hierarchy. The hierarchy is usually you ask your teacher, you ask your parent, you ask your principal, you ask somebody in the workforce to give you a tip on where to go to find the information. And that path to find information through hierarchy is incredibly important, and the internet removed it. It obsoleted that path, which is a lot of what corporate structure provided in the past. And so a millennial that entered high school with a web browser didn't need any of that. You need to do a research project, you just type into, it's probably Alta Vista or something like that back then. You type into that search box and you start doing your research. And that's a big, big change because it means one of the most significant values from corporate structure is no longer useful, and that's access to information or finding the right person. The other piece that I think, if you think about innovation broadly, kind of interesting, everybody wants to innovate. What's interesting looking at the larger companies is that most of the larger companies will cite steady growth year over year, 2%, 3%, they're healthy, they're surviving. But any real growth, so any double-digit growth is coming from innovation. And so all the companies out there are always trying to find innovation or create innovation because innovation is driving, it's the primary driver of real growth that we see. And then we look at startups, and a lot of innovation does come from startups, and the cost of entering a startup has gone way down, especially over the last probably 10 years. As infrastructures become cheaper, software's become cheaper, it's much simpler to launch a new business and a startup. And so we see people who would otherwise maybe have innovated in a company have now chosen or choosing more often to go to startups or to create their own startups where they have an easier path to innovate. So a lot is changing, and if we create a company and have the luxury or the luck of being successful, all of a sudden we have a challenge because all these forces are at play. And so how do we balance that to make sure that great people continue to join our companies, stay at our companies, and contribute and build great things? Because we too want innovation. So in January of last year, we started something that we call the social experiment at Gilt. At the time, we didn't realize it was going to be such a big experiment. But over time, we learned that actually what we had done, the transformation was very difficult, and it was difficult on a human level. And so we came to call it the social experiment. And the social experiment was very simply, can we actually empower small teams to innovate autonomously? And essentially move from this concept that people have ideas and there are backlogs and groups get together to prioritize what we work on, to focus instead on execution and to allow for innovation to occur. We were really careful with the wording there. We believe that actually it's impossible to create innovation. I don't think anybody has figured out that formula. If somebody had, we'd all be following it and innovating constantly. But the reality is innovation is elusive. And so really what we focused on instead is let's create an environment where innovation can occur by really focusing on making it easy for people to ideate and execute to get things to market. I want to talk a little bit on the difference between innovation and the word idea. So a lot of people think of innovation as having an idea. So the most innovative companies are the ones where you have the most exciting ideas. And in most cases, ideas are cheap, and really what matters is execution. So here we define innovation as having an idea, plus the research and development, plus the testing, plus the redesigning, plus the building, plus the getting to market, plus the using. And that bundle is what we'll call execution. So really what we want to do is move away from this concept of just ideating, just having ideas and feeling good about the ideas, and instead putting a real focus and value on true execution. And so when we thought about how to do this within the structure of an organization, and at the time, Gilt Group was probably on the order of 800 employees, maybe 900 employees, I don't remember exactly at that time. And so the idea was, how can we do this? How can we take away all the time we're spending prioritizing? Somebody has an idea. Is it an idea that we work on? Well, I don't know. Let's get a meeting. Who goes to the meeting? The senior people. Well, the senior people tend to have busy calendars, so now we wait 2 weeks for a meeting before we can even decide if we prioritize something. So it never got really, it was always reasonably efficient at Gilt. But we have friends who, in the industry, as they grew their companies, they have 18-month waiting lists to even decide if you're going to prioritize something. That's even before you even decide if you're going to do it, just to have the discussion. 80 months is a long time. That's 3 startups going to market sequentially. It's amazing. So what we decided in the social experiment was, can we change that? And can we change really who gets to decide what we execute as being the key ingredient here? So rather than having to get together and discuss and seek your input and your input and your input and trying to reach consensus, or having a command and control structure where eventually somebody senior says, yes, we are going to take the bet on this. Let's remove that coordination and instead simply distribute the authority or decentralize the authority to decide what we actually build. If you're familiar with Scrum, Scrum does this well. This is actually I will say the only thing that Scrum does well is this. One of my favorite little pictures from Scrum. It's about a breakfast, having ham and eggs for breakfast. And basically, what's the difference for a ham and egg breakfast for the chicken and the pig? A day's work for a chicken, a lifetime commitment for a pig. And in a nutshell, what we were doing at Guilt was saying the pigs get to decide what we build, and the chickens get to watch if they want. It actually sounds reasonably simple, but if you think about it, it actually is counter to the natural way that our world or we as people work. And just as a very personal detail, for example, to a Guilt, if I want to change something at Guilt now, I can't. It is no longer something that I can do. Instead, what I can do is find teams or find people that are working on things, and I have to lobby and convince them to listen to me, to maybe convince them that maybe my idea might be better than something they're working on, that maybe we should invest and execute. And that's a really nice shift of power, because it means the people who are actually doing the work, they have the authority. And everybody else has to support them to help them be successful. So really, it's giving control to the pigs, in a nutshell, if you know Scrum. So how can a growing organization do this? And so we spent a lot of time at Guilt trying to figure this out. So we had an established business. We were agile. Different teams did different things. In some cases, we used the waterfall method. We had kind of prioritization meetings, pretty standard compared to a lot of our peers. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how do you actually take an organization and transform it to a world where individual teams are autonomously making decisions. And so the approach we took, it'll dive a little bit into the tactics on how we actually manage the engineering organization. Is the first thing we did is actually designed the corporate strategy. So we're 800 people, or maybe 1,000 people at that time. Let's actually put down in words what our corporate strategy is. When we were 2 people, we didn't need to do this. It was pretty obvious what we were trying to do. We were just going to grab some inventory and sell it and make people feel amazing for shopping on Guilt. But over time, it gets more complicated because we don't know each other as well. And so really defining specifically what the corporate strategy would be for the foreseeable future. Foreseeable future at Guilt means 3 months, maybe 6. But that's actually quite a long time. And then once we had the corporate strategy, and that's usually, it's not huge, it's usually 3, 4, maybe 5 core ingredients of the corporate strategy at Guilt. We then break that down into a set of initiatives that we want to tackle through technology. And to make that just really concrete, an example of an initiative a year and a half ago was around search engine optimization. So at Guilt, in order to shop, you have to register. Registration is free, but you have to register. And the content, the products that we're selling, and the prices at which we're selling it are never available on search engines. And we did that intentionally because the brands that we work with, these are the best products in the world, and essentially we didn't want to trace out there of what we sold it for. You came as a special event, you got a great deal, you feel amazing, the brand is happy, you learn about a brand, it's over, there's no permanent record. So initially, we shied away from search engine optimization. And we decided that actually there probably is a really nice opportunity there that's good for our membership, it's good for our brand partners, and it's good for Guilt. And we decided we wanted to make a strategic investment in SEO. And so that's part of the strategy. Step 2 then is to take that strategy and turn it into a number of initiatives. And actually I'd say the strategy was actually to grow to acquire new customers through search, and the strategy we took was SEO. The initiative we created was around SEO. We then turned that into KPIs. So KPI stands for Key Performance Indicator. And at its bare minimum, a KPI is basically a metric and something that you measure. And you can choose to have a target at some date in the future, or you can choose not to, and acknowledge as you don't know. It's really that simple. How many people registered this month? That is a metric. Key performance indicators, in reality, are much more complicated than that. And in the SEO example, what we did is said, okay, we want to do SEO. How do we know we're going to be successful? And we eventually settled on the idea of counting the number of people who joined in the last 30 days through search, and the total dollars spent by people who entered the site from search. Those became the 2 KPIs, and now we could measure how we're doing. And then the next step is we have teams. So here we've kind of adapted the 2 pizza box team approach, where the team size can be no bigger than the number of people that can be fed by 2 pizzas. I think it was Amazon that pioneered that concept, but the idea is really small teams. And some of the teams could be 2 people, some of the teams can be as large as 8 people. Teams are these units of people, essentially a family that works together, or a small tribe that works on things together. And as teams evolved at Guild, one thing became very clear is that these teams are cohesive units. So when we talk to the teams, the most important thing that the teams say consistently is like, just do not break up my team. We work really well together. We want to stay together. And so these teams move around essentially as units, and they choose essentially what KPIs they want to tackle, right? So in a perfect world, you have a strategy, a bunch of initiatives like SEO, you have a bunch of KPIs like number of people registered via search, and then you have teams. Put the KPIs on a whiteboard, teams come in, they pick the KPIs they want to work on, and off you go. So that's kind of the model, that teams really adopt KPIs. In practice, it's a little bit harder because the timing is, people are always working on things and there's a transition. But it's turned out that teams basically embrace KPIs, which are the things that they are totally passionate about, right? So the engineer who can't believe that we don't have SEO, and just is like, it would be so easy and so amazing. And by the way, if it's not on sale, we'll create an email alert, so when it goes on sale, we'll tell you. And it's all these ideas for making SEO, loved the KPI around SEO. And this particular person, his name is Yoni. He's a great engineer, great guy, and incredible leader. He was building his team, and he had recruited 2 people to join his team to work on SEO. And there was another engineer and he was looking for 1 more. And there's another engineer in the company who was like, I don't know if I want to work on the SEO initiative or this other initiative. And Yoni just looked at him and said, you are not joining my team. My team is only people who are 100% committed to our initiative, and we are going to kill it. If you're waffling, we do not take you. And he went ahead and built a very core small team that actually executed really well. And the last element of teams is really something we call ingredients. So in a traditional company, when you put together a team to work on a project, you'll say, we need a product manager, we need a project manager, we need a coder, we need a tester. And you go on and on, grabbing people with different titles to put them together on a team. And we found that when we kind of looked at that, we found that was hard. Because sometimes we took an engineer who actually had a great product sense, and then we put a product manager on the same team, and that all of a sudden created conflict, because who really emerges as the authority around product? And when we dug in a little bit deeper, said, well, what are we really doing here? What do titles actually mean? Turns out titles are pretty meaningless, but what was important there is that for a team to be successful, there are about a dozen things that team needs. You need to write code, it has to be tested, you need to have a product vision, you need to have a product strategy, you need a project manager. And there's about a dozen of these things that you need. You need good PR, you need good communication, all of these things. And we call those things ingredients. So there's a dozen ingredients that a team needs. On some initiatives, you may not need all of them, but those are the ingredients, and the ingredients are what is actually important. And so now as we build a team, you start to have, let's say, a team starting to form. There's 2 or 3 people on it, and the engineer has a great product sense. Great, you don't need a product manager on that team. But if you look around and you say, but actually nobody there is strong at project management, well, you have a project management group, and all of a sudden that team is going to that project management group and saying, can one of you please join our team? We really need your help. And that dynamic is incredibly important in the psychology of bringing teams together, because all of a sudden that person has something kind of real to contribute. What we like to say is you can't fake it anymore. People are on a team if they're absolutely contributing, needed, and valuable, and that makes all of us feel good. And if there isn't a value, then that ingredient is filled by somebody else, or it's just not important for that particular project. The psychology of that is really, really important. And a lot of what we're talking about here in terms of trust is really about the psychology of people and people working together, and a lot of subtle things. So here's just a graphical display of how the teams might look. So team 1 has 5 people on it. The little bubbles are the different ingredient that those people bring. So some people may bring 4 ingredients, some 1, some 2. And then they've tackled one initiative, 3 to 6 months, maybe a year later, we changed initiatives, that team stayed together and tackled another initiative. Team 2 has 4 people, they're on their first initiative. Team 3 has 6 people, and they're on to their third initiative. There's kind of one interesting thing is that a lot of goodness does come when team members move from team to team. It's great in terms of new ideas and reinvigoration and learning and sharing. And so what we have done to date is actually just encourage people to move across teams, and that happens occasionally. We've talked to some other companies that require it. It says you have to move at least once every 12 months or once every 18 months to just force that fluidity to break people out of kind of just a comfortable team. And something that we're really thinking about as well. It's just, is there enough value that, if a team's been together for a long time, does it make sense to actually say, you know what, we should really think about maybe mixing things up. Just to make that super concrete, as when we started Guilt, I think our first 100,000 lines of code had exactly 0 lines of test code. And over time, today, it's actually kind of the opposite. We've gone very strongly into automated testing. When team members have embraced testing and found that actually you can develop faster when you write the right tests, when those team members join a team that has not yet learned that about testing, you see amazing things happen, because all of a sudden that person can share what they've learned around testing, and quality and speed just go up. Kind of amazing. I want to touch on probably the most important step around KPIs, and that is really that at the end of the day, you have to manage by the KPI and by the KPI only. And this is what created I would say, what made the transition at Guilt to this model most difficult. So in a command and control structure, there is always a decision that's bubbled up, and somebody gets to make the decision on what we do. If you have that structure and you transition to a decentralized model driven by KPIs, the decision is made by the team. That means one way to look at that is the person who used to make the decision has lost the ability to make that decision. And as human beings, we do not like to lose things. And so that key concept is really fundamentally what creates kind of a lot of emotion in the transition. And I think what we learned over time, and this is something we didn't anticipate, we didn't think it'd be that big a deal in the beginning, because we always talk about empowerment and we always talk about making sure our teams can move quickly and make their decisions. But at the end of the day, to actually do it created some tension. So today, the way we manage the teams is every 2 weeks, the teams meet with their manager, and the conversation always starts by looking at the KPIs. And that's it. We built a little KPI server, kpi.guilt.com, backed by a Google spreadsheet, and it draws little charts, and that's it. And so management meeting, pull up the KPI. You look at the chart. The chart has a line, it's graphed, there's usually a target. How are we doing? Do you need help? Great, good job. And that's it. That's the extent of the meeting. What is tempting for all of us to do, particularly kind of in the age of the internet, we all think we're great. We all think we have great product vision, and we're excellent at user experience. And so, of course, we have ideas for how to improve things. And it's when we do that, when we go beyond the KPI and start offering suggestions and tips for changing this or changing that or adding this or building that, what we're doing is putting pressure on the teams that says, you have to do these things that I'm telling you, as opposed to allowing the teams to invent how they're going to actually reach the result. And the result is what actually matters. Does this KPI move in the right direction? We'll come back. So I'd say at Guilt, this is kind of really the critical step. I'm going to give one other example on KPIs that's a little bit personal. I'm married and have 2 boys, 4 and 8. And my wife says to me one day that, it seems like we're yelling at our 4-year-old quite a bit. And so I look at her and said, we need a KPI. So I proposed that our KPI is the number of times we have yelled at our 4-year-old in the last 30 days. And she kind of looks at me, I think maybe that was a little bit crazy. But what was interesting is all of a sudden we had to think about it. Like, how many times did we actually yell at him over the last 30 days? Because we never really thought about it, right? You just imagine you're emotional, and so it's like, maybe we yelled at him 3 times in the last 30 days? Oh, 3, that's kind of interesting. Does that feel like a lot? I mean, prefer maybe it to be 0, but we're not perfect. And so all of a sudden we're discussing what actually matters. And we haven't changed our process, we haven't built anything, we haven't had any meetings with our son to talk about changes. We haven't done anything, we're not invested in anything. Yet we're talking about what really matters. And then we can make a decision, do we actually want to change something here or not? And if we decide to change something, next month, guess what? We can look at it and say, did the thing that we changed make a difference in what we said we cared about or not? And that's the power of the KPI in a nutshell. It makes it very easy to quickly get into the debate of what really, really matters, and then provides this tool to allow teams to be empowered. So say that we found that it works. It really empowers teams. It allows us to focus on execution. And I would say it enables innovation. It does not create innovation, but it allows for innovation. And I want to shift just a little bit and talk a bit more about people. And as I was growing up, my father was born in Poland. My family's Polish. My father came to America to live the American dream. Started 8 startups in high tech and real science in Silicon Valley, 6 of them successful. And I remember he told me once a story of people. And he always made a point to hire great people. And they were bleeding edge of physical technology on silicon. So real science, or materials and things like stiction and atoms actually matter. And so they'd hire incredibly intelligent people. And he told me this story once where he saw one of the guys he works with, who I think had 7 advanced degrees, like 3 PhDs and 4 masters in different sciences, and he was making a mistake. And my dad knew it, as much as you can know something like that. And so they argued, and then I remember my dad saying is, I made the decision to hire a smart and autonomous person. So he's not going to listen to me, no matter what. I just can't. It is his decision, and I have to watch. And it was 3 to 6 months later, and the person realized that actually he had made a mistake. That actually, in this instance, my father happened to have been correct, and they, in one sense, wasted 3 to 6 months. On the other hand, that's the cost of hiring smart and autonomous people. And what I learned from my dad was that you can you get a choice in this, and you can hire smart and autonomous people. You can hire people that will essentially thrive in a command and control environment. Both models work. If you hire from one camp and try to manage the other way, that is hard. And that led us to think about the smart and autonomous people, because those are the people that we decided we wanted to hire at Gilt. And so we thought a lot about what they want. And the first one is really important. It's really to make their own project decisions. They want the authority. We want the authority to make our own decisions of what we're building. We want to build something that matters. We want to impact business directly and see how our work is actually used. A lot of people think about this in terms of features, like can a user do X, or is the user experience better? I think a good example in our business is on our logistics side. We actually move hundreds of thousands of units of physical merchandise every week and ship them to customers. And that team that handles the movement from order submitted to order on the UPS truck, they had to slow down the software. It was too fast. Our customers were asking us, please take more time to ship my stuff. You're shipping it too fast. And what was happening is they wanted to buy at noon, and then they wanted to come home and buy at night, and then they wanted those things to come out in one box. And we were boxing things within 30 minutes. They were, from click, they were on the UPS truck. That team did an amazing job, and they saw how they could impact the business. These people, I like to use the word well-being. A lot of people talk about happiness. Happiness seems to be in the news a lot. The pursuit of happiness, our right to pursue happiness is a basis of this country. And I think actually well-being is a better adjective, which is kind of the difference between well-being and happiness, is that to be happy, sometimes things happen which make you unhappy. And so you can never attain happiness. It is a fleeting thing. It can come and go. Well-being is the ability to be happy and the ability to actually maintain perspective and move forward even in light of difficulty. And we think about that a lot. Some other companies I've heard will refer to this as kind of the victim mentality. Like, we do not want to be victims. We want to make our own decisions and be able to control our own fate. And when things don't go as planned, we want to be able to solve them and move forward. And everybody we talk to says they want to work with great people. I personally have defined great for myself as people that are better than me, because I think that's an objective measure. I meet those people all the time. But I don't know how to define great in a kind of abstract, uniform way. So I think people want to work with great people, and those are people that they can learn from. And if we think about all these things that people want, kind of make the claim that actually all they really want is trust. It's like, let's work together, you do this, I do this, we're going to build a great company, we're going to build a great product, but just trust me, I'll do my part. And I trust you to do your part. And so let's think about trust in engineering. So we trust our engineers to write software, to manage our systems, to change our databases, but do we really trust their judgment? I don't know if anyone here has the pleasure of working with auditors. No? So I used to not enjoy working with auditors, actually. And then during the social experiment, that all changed. And I learned that actually, there's a couple of interesting things with auditors. Actually, our interests are aligned. And today when we meet with auditors, the first conversation always goes, our interests are aligned. You are here to help us minimize risk to our business. We, of course, like to minimize risk to our business. The greatest risk to our business is actually that our people become disengaged. So everything that we do is going to be first optimized for our people. And then we're going to talk and think about all the secondary effects. And so that's a little bit different. And if you know the audit world, you know that what auditors want, particularly at public companies, is they want separation of responsibility, which means that one person, the person who writes code, does not deploy code to production. They want documentation and control so that when something breaks, you can trace it back and put in place a process to make sure that this thing never breaks again. We looked at all of those things and said, actually, in engineering, that makes engineers feel like victims, and it decreases their sense of well-being and decreases their ability to contribute, so we're not going to do any of that. And what instead we're going to do is just trust our engineers to do the right things. I'll give just a few other examples. So we have a tech blog, tech.guilt.com, and I remember when we were talking about launching the tech blog a few years ago, questions like, so who can post to the blog? And what's the process? And the typical answer, the default answer is like, oh, anybody, you just write something and then send it to your manager or whatever, and your manager will approve it and it'll go live. We looked at that and we said that approval is a point of centralization, and it is disempowering because it says we don't trust you to use your judgment to balance what you want to say with the value of the brand and what we're doing as a company. That's what it says. And the end result is that people will post less to the blog. And when something goes wrong, it's the manager's fault because the manager approved it. And so the policy is anyone can post to the blog anytime, go have fun. And there's a shared doc with like, here's the account to Tumblr, here's the username, here's the password, go post. And it's amazing. It's amazing. The KPI on the blog is the number of new posts in the last 30 days. And we just saw that thing kind of rise. And the content that's on there, I mean, it's an engineering group. We do great engineering stuff. At the same time, you'll get a picture of the, the dry bar and the whiskey tasting table because one of the teams is into rye right now, and that makes its way out to the tech blog. And that's Guilt. It's transparent. This is new. I kind of like this one. Who can throw a party? Anybody, anytime. The fine print says as long as the spreadsheet still has money left. And so here's another one. It's we're working together. You did a good job. I want to take you out for a cup of coffee or maybe buy you lunch and say thank you. How do I do that? Well, I write my manager and say, can I please pre-approve $40 to take so-and-so to lunch? And so what happens, either I take you out to lunch and pay for it myself, or I just don't take you out to lunch. Because there's friction there. And so we started a few months ago. We call it the peer-to-peer budgeting experiment, I guess. And basically what it is on a monthly basis, we say, here's how many tens of thousands of dollars we're going to allocate to to the fund budget. Here's the part of the fund budget, right? And it's a Google spreadsheet, and it's in cell A1 is the number for that month. And then there is a bunch of blank lines. And so if you want to take somebody out, you just put your name, what you're doing, how much you're spending, and then you go do it. And it's a really complicated formula. Cell A1 minus the sum of how much people have spent. When it goes negative, it turns red. If you enter your line and it turns red, can't do it. But please keep it on there so that that's a signal that maybe we need to reevaluate how much money we need in the fund budget. And over time, what we really hope to do is then connect that back to the company. And we have financial goals for the company. And imagine that we're always in the red because people want to have more fun. When do we not want to have more fun? Company exceeds financial goals, and then to be able to feed that back and say we're increasing our fund budget because we nailed it on the financial metrics that matter, like that's pretty powerful and just makes sense. And what falls out of it also is this notion from the scientific and academic communities around peer review. And we love peer review. It absolutely works. And this system normalizes how our tribe, how our group spends money on partying because it's 100% transparent. It's completely peer reviewed and frictionless. So again, kind of the key theme here is this idea of decentralization and to decentralize by default. So whenever a new problem arises or a new question arises or a new challenge or something that we're thinking about, what we try to do is say, how can we decentralize this decision so that it doesn't require friction and approval? Because we trust our teams to make the right decision. Sometimes we've been accused of lazy management. You don't want to make a decision, you want the teams to make the decision. And actually, I would argue that in practice, this is actually much harder, because what we have to do, what we're forced to do, is really think through how this will work, and then we put it out there for peer review, or people create things and then it's peer reviewed. And that's it. So it actually has to be thought all the way through. You don't get the free pass of making a subjective judgment. It has to be objective and thought through. There's a great story. Decentralization can go too far. Like, all great ideas can go too far. I think it's one of the things. There's balance in everything that we do. There is a gentleman by the name of Derek Sivers who wrote a book, a very short book, I think you can read it in an hour, called Anything You Want. And it is his story in the late 90s of starting a company called CD Baby, which was for independent artists to sell CDs. And he decentralized everything. And it worked incredibly well until the day that the employees voted him out of profit sharing. So he tells that story, and then the system fell apart, and he ended up selling the company. So the book is amazing because it talks about this journey that he did, where really he created true and complete empowerment. It's kind of amazing, and just incredible lessons for all of us on kind of the value, and then the recognition that it actually can go too far. On the can go too far piece, what we've come to use is actually a new term that emerged this week, and I like it. It's called Emergent Centralization. So the idea is that we decentralize by default, and then what happens is actually there'll be opportunities where the teams will come together and say, you know what, I think we should centralize this. Anytime there's centralization, there is bureaucracy and process that comes with it. It's unavoidable. And so by decentralizing by default and letting centralization emerge where it's necessary, we can make sure that we don't centralize too much, and then we're forcing a very conscious decision around the cost of centralization before we centralize, and that's critically important. We do the same thing with symmetry is another term we use a lot at Gilt, and the idea is that we prefer symmetry. Symmetry can be defined as changing something yet it remains the same. So imagine a triangle and you rotate it, it remains the same. And that means that by default we want to do things the same. If we look at, and in some cases you want to try to do something different. So you look at the databases in use at Gilt, you need a database, can I use one of those? No, I need a new one. Well, why do you need a new one? And it forces us to be very, very explicit about the reasons for which we want to break symmetry. A good example of symmetry comes from nature. That's where it's all from. And nature basically is created through symmetry, yet everything amazing in nature comes from a break in symmetry. And that's essentially what we're trying to model, and kind of this model of decentralized by default, but allow centralization to emerge where it's worth the cost. So after reading Derek Sivers' book, my older son was, I think, 5 or 6 years old. And so he asked me one day, he said, Daddy, what are your rules? What rules do we have in the household? And I said, I don't think we have any rules. He says, well, you have to have some rules. I said, do well in school, rule number 1. He said, what else? I said, I think that might be it. But then we got home and I remembered his book, and my son left his bicycle on the driveway. I said, can you bring your bike in? He said, no, you do it, Daddy. I said, rule number 2, if you can do it yourself, you do it yourself. He says, okay, and what else? I said, beyond that, you can do anything you want. That's what I told my 5 or 6 year old. Maybe it was 4, I don't remember. And then, a couple months go by, and he had some jokes. He's like, morning, it's like, groggy, Daddy, can you help me put on my pants? I'm gonna put on my pants. Like, haha, I got you because I could have done it, but I got you to do it. So he had a lot of fun with this anything you want business. And then he did something where he upset his parents. And he's crying, and he's looking at me, he says, but you told me I can do anything I want. I said, and you did, and now you deal with the consequences, which is amazing. All right, so I'm going to transition a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about fear. We've talked about trust. Now I want to talk about fear, and then I want to close with some just comments around the technology that's needed to enable this in an engineering group. So the first is fear of errors. So you go to a team and say, you can do anything you want, do it. And the team's like, what do you mean? I said, well, build something. Okay, what do I build? I don't know, create it. Deploy it to production. Well, what if it doesn't work? What if I bring the mobile apps down? What if I create a bug and nobody can submit an order? And all of a sudden, this fear of making a mistake weighs in on people's ability to do things. And so generally, the philosophy here is to really accept errors. We'll talk about how we do that. And then invest in transparency and real-time feedback. And that's, if we come back kind of when talking to auditors, for example, there's a part of audit called continuous auditing, which is the idea that you just automate what you want to audit, right? So like, if you are worried about people being able to register in your application, well, just count how many people have registered in the application this minute, and that's it. And then build automated alerts that are intelligent to look for trends and that sort of thing. So that real-time feedback is really important because it provides transparency on what actually matters. And by having the feedback, if you make a mistake, you'll know, and you'll fix it. And that's really the model we're after, and that's a really healthy model. The really unhealthy model is I make a change, and then my boss comes to me and says, you broke this, fix it. Then I don't feel so good. If I make a change and I see it's broken and I roll back immediately, that feels great. It's just part of our everyday life and process. So there's a few pieces of technology that are really kind of enabling. The first is something we call lots of small applications. I have a sticker here called LOSA, so it's a real thing. This is more a core part of our tech strategy. And the idea here, if you've kind of read about microservices, is to really embrace a microservices approach to developing software. Second is something we call Ion Cannon, which is our continuous delivery system. And third is something called Galactica, which is our infrastructure platform as a service. So let's talk about lots of small applications. We really mean lots of small applications. It means that if you want to create a new table, we are going to encourage you to create a new database. If you would like to add a resource to an existing service, we are going to encourage you to create a new service. If you would like to add a new screen to one of the applications, we will encourage you to write a new web application. And that means that we've gone from a small number of large monolithic applications to a large number of code bases. Each one, we grew from, I think, 5 or 10 code bases to almost 1,000 now over the last couple of years. And we really like that. We have lots of small applications, lots of small databases, lots of small teams, and lots of small errors, really. Loser, L-O-S-E-R, which is really what we're after. That's exactly what we want. And if we look at kind of how this has evolved at Guilt over time, we started this social experiment. You kind of see where the graph ticks up. Actually, so we had about 50 applications in January 2012 when we kicked this off. And then you just see the slope kick up as people develop these applications. Now, the reason to go the route of microservices, there's a lot of good technical reasons. In a monolithic application, if I want to contribute code, so I join your company and you have a code base and I want to make a change, I have to learn your style, learn your code base, and then push some code to the repository, and maybe, hopefully, you'll code review it, and then you'll tell me all the things I did that you don't like or that are wrong. And then I have to do it again until you are happy. So I am your slave. I work for you. If I have the freedom of creating my own repository, then I am king, and I can do whatever I want and move quickly. So what ended up happening is that over time, people emerge as owners of their applications, true owners because they own the code bases, and they therefore are king or queen. They now have the ability to code review people who contribute to their projects, and they feel great about the process of contributing to other people's projects because they can now respect the authority of that person, right? So if somebody tells me that they don't like this bracket or this comma, it's like, fine, this is your project. I'm happy to change it, I'll change it, it's yours. By the way, if you come contribute to my project, you're gonna do it my way, and it kind of settles. And it's actually how open source works. And so as developers, it's an easy model to understand, we found. But the key here is that actually lots of things are owned. Individual people can own small numbers of things. And they're separate code bases, so you remove this kind of bloat. You isolate the risk of changes having unanticipated consequences. You minimize that probability of errors cascading in a certain sense. Right now, about 2 years in, we are now considering changing LOSA to MoMA, so going from lots of small applications to a moderate number of moderately sized applications. And so one of the real challenges is when is it right to draw the boundary? But what we've really learned is that it's easier to compose 2 small services into one than to take one service and break it up into 2. And so we'll err on the side of lots of them, and then if it gets annoying, we can compose them. The second is continuous delivery. So continuous delivery at Gilt basically means you type SBT release and your code is in production. This is also critical. And if you think about kind of the strategy of lots of small applications, how do you manage that in terms of infrastructure and operations becomes a real challenge. And that's where we've really invested a significant amount of time to build good tooling around. So Ion Cannon is one of those. And the idea, kind of the software development process at Gilt basically works as you write some code, you push it to Gerrit. We use Gerrit for source code review. When it's merged to master, it's on master, and then you can type SBT release. Master or SBT release dash remote is even better. It'll kick off a Jenkins job, which grabs master, installs it, runs all the tests. If they pass, it creates an RPM, puts the RPM into Ion Cannon. Ion Cannon grabs the RPM, installs it into a pre-production environment, runs all the tests, runs all the integration tests, runs all the tests that other teams have contributed to your project. And then when it's successful, promotes the RPM to a production repository, and then goes host by host, installs the RPM, runs the health check, and then continues rolling back where is necessary. And so the consequence of this is that actually every release is small, and you know what's changed in production. And so if it doesn't work, rollback is simple. So at Gilt, for example, we don't have a network operations center because we don't need one. People know immediately if they've broken something or not. And the ripple effect is usually small. The notion of contributed tests is something pretty unique. So we had a problem early on where somebody would make a change in a database, and then that would break the ETL process going into the data warehouse, that sort of thing. And the data warehouse team is like, you know, these guys keep breaking our stuff. It's so annoying. And actually, that's a victim mentality. And so what we did is we built a system where we said, well, there's a text file called test.spec. You go in there and you put in a command, just one line per test suite to run, build a test suite, add it to the repo, and every time they try to deploy, it'll run their tests, and then it'll run your tests. And if it fails, the person writing the code will know. Because do you think they wanted to break the ETL process? No, of course not. And so that's really kind of an empowering thing, right? You can take ownership and go contribute tests. And the last piece is really something called Galactica. This is still a work in progress, but super exciting and getting into high gear. So if we think about decentralization, you have your own repo, you can deploy it via Ion Cannon, but you have to deploy it somewhere. And that somewhere today is a Jira ticket to our infrastructure team. And what they're trying to do is just automate that. And we call that Galactica. So platform as a service, Heroku for inside the enterprise or something like that. And essentially, this is kind of the API we want. This is pseudocode. I did not compile it, so if there's a bug, I'm sorry. But basically, a team will say, I want to allocate a server. And the idea is they can say, I want 2 gig RAM, I want solid state drives, whatever. And that will allocate a slice of a server in a database. It doesn't actually do anything physical yet. And say I want to deploy my software to this server, my service name service foo version 1.0. Then I want to add that deployed software into our load balancer to start giving it some traffic. Now I'm going to find all the old versions and take them out of the load balancer. And then at some point in the future, we can go garbage collect the allocations given to the prior version. So the idea is to provide a real simple API to allow developers to allocate space and deploy the things with no human interaction necessary. We internally call this so some people, was it DevOps or NoOps? So we shunned all those terms because we created a better term called zero waiting. We want people to be able to work without waiting for other human beings. This is over the last year, we actually did the work. We're building this on top of LXC, and we contributed the LXC support to CloudStack, which is an Apache project for managing infrastructure. And we were feeling great about where we were going. And then this little thing called Docker.io came, and that is amazing. So we're pretty bullish on it. It's not in production yet, so I don't know if it'll work out or not. But I will say that if you haven't seen Docker.io on the infrastructure side, that is worth looking at. It's one of the few times where it's just, wow, this is revolutionary. So I want to touch on just one last concept because I love it. And it's this concept called anti-fragile, and there's a book by this name. So anti-fragile is the opposite of fragile. So the way to think about this is you put a fragile item, say a glass, in a box, and you shake the box and you open the box, the glass breaks. You take a robust item like a stone, you put it in a box, and you shake the box and you open the box, you take the stone out, the stone is unchanged. Take an anti-fragile item, you put it in the box, you shake the box, you take it out, it is stronger than it was before it went into the box. And our goal is to create anti-fragile systems. And really by developing this environment where we know we can make small errors, we know we'll know exactly when they happen, and then we know we can automate the testing to make sure they never come back. Actually, after every error, guilt is stronger, and that's really the goal. Anti-fragile can seem a little bit like an abstract concept. The best anti-fragile system is actually our own bodies. And if you think about going for a run, what do you do when you run? You actually damage your muscles, and then your body heals, and when it heals, you're actually stronger than you were when you started. And that really is the goal. That's what we want to build. We don't want to build robust systems, we want to build anti-fragile systems. One of the things that's really important here in terms of errors and culture, like people always say, like we accept errors. Very few places do. The big thing with errors is it's really emotional, right? I made a mistake, I affected our customers. I don't like that. And I like it even less when my peers think I made a mistake. So we spent a lot of time thinking about how do we remove the emotion from errors? And so anti-fragile is kind of one component of it. Lots of small errors is another. And there's this third piece that internally we call perfect day. And it is a process, a centralized process that we've created, modeled after Kaizen from kind of Japanese manufacturing. So the idea is that whenever anything happens that creates an experience that is less than perfect, it simply goes in a queue, and on Thursday a group looks at it and does root cause discussion, brainstorming, and then we prioritize prevention of that error from ever happening again above everything else that we do. And that allows people to make mistakes, and it's no longer crisis or shameful. It's you made a mistake, fine. Thank you for trying to do something great. It's good to come to the meeting Thursday, and as an organization, we will prioritize the work together to make sure that we can detect it or prevent it from happening again. And the idea there is that over time that quickly converges, but it frees up kind of the emotional space to go try something. So as we wrap up, I just want to kind of close with, at the end of the day, it's great people that do great things, and we can really empower them with real trust, and that's trust at every step of the way. And in order to do it in an organization, we need to reduce the risk, and we'd argue the best way to do that is just really by focusing on creating transparency and real-time feedback for everything that we're doing. So, thank you. I'm glad to take any questions if there are some. Yes?
Thank you, by the way. Question for you. So when you were identifying the ingredients, like the tasks and roles that were necessary for teams to function efficiently and effectively, to understand what you're looking for, was that something derived from the teams themselves? Like, did you go ask the entire company, or was that something handed down on high? I only ask because it's like, for example, project management is not something that most IT teams consider to be a necessary component.
Yeah.
But obviously, there's a lot of business value to those structures. So
Yeah.
how did you identify those ingredients?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, and I think, so just repeat the question, which is how did we identify the ingredients that different teams would need? And I'd say really it came from retrospectives over time. And so kind of we do something and then we launch it and then we do a retrospective and say, you know, this could have been better. How could we make that better? And that's where things like, oh, we didn't have communication, we didn't have project management. That's where those ideas emerged. And really the way we approach it, so kind of those ideas, I'd say, I think there's like 12 or maybe 14 now ingredients. Not all teams have all ingredients, right? And so project management is actually a good one. If there's a group that's working on something kind of really kind of siloed or directly with the team, like an internal project, and you're just working with the business team and business unit using that project, you don't need project management, you're sitting together, and all the communication is easy. If we're doing an integration with a third party, that's a whole different story. And we absolutely need the project management. And so, so to answer your question, I'd say it's kind of evolved over time, and usually from retrospectives where either kind of things could have gone better or there was friction that we wanted to remove. And then second, it's just because we have the ingredients doesn't mean we force them on every team or every project. Yes, sir?
Question on code ownership. Is it by individual or by team? And if it's by
Yeah.
individual, how does that morph over time? It's either they leave the company or they change teams.
Yeah, so the question is, how does code ownership work? Is it by individual or team? So within every Garrett repo, we have an external configuration file. So the format's config, external, Garrett, reviewers.yaml, and that lists the people who are the owners of that project. And that will start always, we try to have at least 2 people working together, at least not pair programming, but 2 people who are sharing knowledge and brainstorming is kind of the goal. So you usually start off with 2 people. As people leave the company, is kind of a challenge. And so one way is that we just ask, does somebody want to adopt this piece of software? And if nobody wants to adopt it, then maybe we should turn it off. So we'll ask that question. And then second is, broadly in the architecture sense, we have this model where we have a core platform, and we call it the satellite model because we have these little satellites, and we have lots of satellites. And a satellite could be, we didn't experiment with WebSockets and live inventory feeds and that sort of thing. That was a satellite up here. We don't care too much about the quality of that piece of software or the ownership of the long-term maintenance. However, if other teams start using that, then it's a candidate for maybe bringing it into the core. And that's really kind of through natural selection. The teams have selected that this thing is valuable. We haven't invented it or tried to predict. And at that point, we are actually right now, just now building a team that could more formally adopt contributions to the core platform. And we'll see how that goes. Obviously, it has pros and cons, but that's what we're trying next. I think we have time for one more question. Yep.
So as you went to break these out into small individually owned projects, how do you guarantee sort of consistency and interoperability between
Yeah.
all these individual applications?
Yeah, so as we made the move to microservices, how do we guarantee the consistency and essentially that things continue to work? Is that right? So one thing is that we went really slowly on this, right? So we didn't put together an effort to create the microservices infrastructure. As we tackled new projects, we created new services. And then where those services depended on legacy pieces, that's when we took the opportunity to say, do we want to break out that legacy piece into a separate service? And so it's actually been a pretty slow migration. And even today, our monolithic repositories have the highest number of commits on a monthly basis. But as a percentage, that's now, as a percentage of overall commits, it's actually decreasing. So I think that's the first thing, is just to do it slowly. Second, the system is no longer consistent. As soon as the second database is added, kind of that consistency is gone. And third, one thing that was kind of interesting is that we did make a commitment that we will spend more time developing software that is backwards compatible. So there is, in production, Gilt runs a single version, right? Gilt, whatever's in production right now, has to work together. And so there is only one version of Gilt. And that means every change has to be backwards compatible. And the only time that we break that symmetry, we actually never break that symmetry. And that means that as changes go to production, if there is a problem, we know because of the feedback, and then we can just roll back. Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much.